The mist hung low over the killing field, like a funeral shroud, thick and suffocating, carrying the stench of death across the muddy valley. The smell was overwhelming, a nauseating mixture of blood, voided bowels, and the beginning stages of decay, accelerated by the alien world's heat. Bodies lay scattered across the churned earth like broken dolls tossed by a petulant god, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, human soldiers in their battered steel armor, faces frozen, expressions of terror or rage or simple exhaustion mixed with alien warriors, whose distinctive blue skin now looked gray and lifeless in the pale morning light. The ground had been transformed into a soup of red and thick cobalt blood, pooling in the craters left by fallen war beasts and the impact of siege. Weapons littered the ground like fallen leaves, swords and spears and axes, many still clutched in dead hands that refused to release them. The battlefield was silent except for the wind that whistled mournfully through torn banners and broken spears jutting from the ground like grave markers. No birds sang their dawn chorus, no insects buzzed in search of flowers. Even the carrion eaters, the vultures, and the scavengers that usually appeared within hours of a battle's end seemed to have abandoned this particular corner of hell, as if even they found the scope of the slaughter too obscene to approach. The silence was unnatural, oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of cooling metal or the rustle of fabric moved by wind. Near the center of the field where the fighting had been thickest, a pile of corpses shifted suddenly. A hand emerged, Clear's throat pale and trembling with exhaustion, pushing aside the considerable weight of dead flesh. Michael crawled out from beneath the body of his commanding officer, a young lieutenant whose name he struggled to remember through the fog of pain and shock. The boy had taken an arrow meant for Michael and died instantly. Now his corpse had served one final purpose, shielding his sergeant from detection. Michael was 45 years old, built like an ox from 20 years of military service, with scars that told the story of battles fought on a dozen different fronts. His face was weathered like old leather, his beard matted with a mixture of blood and mud, his eyes hollow and sunken from witnessing too many deaths of too many friends. He coughed violently, spitting out dust and the copper taste of blood from where he had bitten his tongue during the fighting. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he moved. He ran his hands over himself with the practiced efficiency of a veteran, checking systematically for wounds. His ribs ached from bruising, probably cracked. His left knee was swollen, but the worst was his left shoulder, where pain lanced through him like a hot blade. With every breath, an arrow protruded from the meat of his deltoid, its shaft already broken off halfway, but the bone point was still buried deep in the muscle. Michael recognized the design. Alien manufacture, carved from some creature's leg bone, barbed to make removal nearly impossible without tearing flesh. He bit down hard on his leather sleeve, muffling the scream that wanted to escape as he snapped the arrow shaft completely off, leaving just a stub protruding from his shoulder. Pulling the barbed point out would mean bleeding to death in minutes, and he was too far from any medic to risk it. Better to keep it lodged and hope that infection would take its time killing him, giving him at least a few days to find safety or die trying. He lay there for a moment longer, staring up at the gray sky that promised Rain trying to piece together how the battle had ended. There had been a charge at dawn, the thunder of war drums, and the screech of the alien war beasts, the clash of steel on stone weapons. Then an enemy Ursar had broken through. Their line and everything had dissolved into chaos. After that, nothing clears throat but darkness and the crushing weight of bodies piling on top of him as both sides fell where they stood. Now he was alone. Utterly, completely alone. Michael forced himself to stand, swaying with dizziness as his blood pressure adjusted. The silence was worse than any battle. At least in combat, you knew what to expect, where the threats would come from. This emptiness felt apocalyptic, like he was the last living thing in a dead world. He began moving through the corpses with grim, methodical purpose. Sentiment was a luxury the dead could no longer afford, and the living needed every advantage if they wanted to stay that way. He found a leather water flask on the corpse of a sergeant he vaguely recognized, barely a mouthful of tepid water left inside. But he took it gratefully, from a fallen alien warrior with elaborate tattoos marking him as some kind of officer. Michael pulled a short sword with a wickedly curved blade. The metal was dark, almost black, and strangely light for its size. He tested the edge against his thumb and hissed. Razor sharp, his own right boot had been completely shredded by something with very large claws, the leather torn to ribbons and useless. He unlaced a serviceable replacement from a corpse, roughly his size, trying not to think about the blood squelching inside as he pulled it on. Among the dead, half buried in mud, Michael discovered what might prove most valuable of all, a map. It was drawn on treated hide, its surface sticky with partially dried blood that obscured some of the details. But he could still make out terrain, features, water sources, what looked like settlements both human and alien. He folded it carefully and tucked it inside his torn jacket, against his chest where it would stay relatively dry. His goal had crystallized with brutal simplicity in his mind: survive, get out of this valley of death, find friendly forces or die trying. Everything else was secondary. As he picked his way through the carnage, Michael suddenly heard something that made him freeze mid-step. A sound faint and mewling, like a wounded animal caught in a trap. It came from the direction of a massive carcass that dominated the eastern edge of the battlefield. The Ursar was what the aliens called it, though human soldiers had less polite names for the war beasts. This one had been enormous even by Ursar standards, bred for shock assaults and breaking shield walls. Standing, it would have been the size of 3 bulls side by side, with thick blue-black fur covering muscles like corded steel, and tusks the length of a man's arm that could gore a horse and flip it through the air. Now it lay on its side like a collapsed mountain, its flank torn open by dozens of spears, its yellow eyes glazed over with a film of death. The sound came again, definitely not from the beast itself, from beneath it. Michael approached slowly, the scaven spear held ready in his good hand. He had seen too many soldiers killed by wounded enemies, playing dead by traps left in the aftermath of battle. Trust nothing, assume everything, wanted you dead. That philosophy had kept him alive this long. As he circled the massive corpse, he saw it, a gap beneath the creature's massive foreleg where the ground had compressed under thousands of pounds of weight but not completely flattened. In that small hollow, pressed against the muddy earth like a mouse in a burrow, sat a child. She was perhaps 10 years old, small even. For that age, her skin the distinctive blue of the alien race. Not the pale blue of a summer sky, but darker, richer, the color of twilight. Water, she wore what had once been fine clothing, judging by the quality of the weave, but it was now torn and filthy beyond recognition. Gold ornaments hung from her neck and wrists, delicate chains and bangles that marked her as nobility among her kind. Her hair was black as coal and matted with dried mud and what might have been blood. Her leg was pinned beneath the Ursar's massive paw, the limb disappearing into shadow under thousands of pounds of dead weight. But from the angle and the fact that she was conscious and alert, Michael guessed it was more trapped than crushed. If the bone had been shattered, she would likely be in shock or unconscious. From the pain, she stared up at him with eyes that were large and golden, like a cat's eyes, and they held absolutely no plea for mercy, only the feral calculation of a cornered predator weighing its chances of survival against a larger predator that had found it. Michael studied her for a long moment, his mind working through the implications, every instinct, every lesson learned in 2 decades of brutal warfare told him to walk away. She was the enemy. Her people had killed his friends, burned villages he was supposed to protect, slaughtered children in midnight raids on border settlements. The war between their species had been going on so long that no one even remembered anymore who had started it or what the original grievance had been. It simply was like the rising of the sun or the turning of the seasons. But she was also just a child, and somewhere buried deep beneath the scar tissue and the cynicism and the survivor's callousness, Michael had once been a father. He'd had a daughter before the war took everything, before the raid that left his home in ashes and his family as corpses. Looking at this alien child trapped and helpless reminded him of things he had tried very hard to forget. He made a decision that might get him killed. Michael drove the spear into the soft earth and wedged it under the Ursar's massive foreleg, using it as a lever. The beast's fur was coarse and thick, reeking of old blood, musk, and the sweet sour smell of death already beginning. He pushed down on the spear shaft with all his strength, the muscles in his back screaming in protest, his wounded shoulder sending spikes of agony through his body. The massive limb shifted, rising just a few inches, but enough. The moment the crushing pressure released, the girl moved like lightning striking from a clear sky. Her hands shot out and snatched up a sharp fragment of stone, and she lunged at Michael's leg, aiming with deadly precision for the major artery in his inner thigh. If that stone connected, he would bleed out in under a minute. Despite his exhaustion, despite the pain and the blood loss, Michael's reflexes saved him. He caught her thin wrist strike, his callous fingers wrapping around bone that felt too delicate, too fragile, like catching a bird. She hissed at him like a cat, baring teeth that were sharper than human teeth, more pointed, clearly designed for tearing meat. Her free hand clawed at his arm, drawing fresh blood with nails that were almost claws. Michael looked into her eyes and saw nothing but crystalline hate, no confusion, no gratitude, no childish fear, just pure distilled hatred of the enemy. who had killed her people on this field. Good, some distant part of him thought. Hate kept you sharp, hate kept you alive, fear made you stupid, made you freeze, made you easy prey. He twisted her wrist just hard enough to force her fingers open, not enough to break the delicate bones. The stone fell to the mud with a wet plop. Then he released her and stepped back, giving her space. The girl scrambled backward like a crab, favoring her trapped leg but not falling. She didn't clear his throat. Try to run, where would she go? The field of corpses stretched in every direction for hundreds of yards, and beyond that lay the jungle, an absolute maze of death for someone who didn't know every trail and water source. Michael pulled out a length of rope he had scavenged earlier from a supply pack, its fibers still stiff with dried blood from its previous owner. The girl saw it, and her golden eyes widened, the pupils contracting to vertical slits in a way that was distinctly inhuman. She tried to back away further, but her injured leg betrayed her balance, and she stumbled, catching herself on her hands. When Michael approached with the rope, she went absolutely wild with the desperate fury of a trapped animal. She bit at him viciously, her teeth catching the leather of his sleeve and actually managing to puncture through to the skin beneath, drawing blood. She clawed and kicked with her free leg, her nails raking across his forearm and leaving red welts. For such a small creature, she fought with surprising strength, born of pure survival instinct. But Michael had wrestled full-grown men, trying to kill him with knives and bare hands. A child, even a furious alien one, fighting for her life, was no real threat to someone with his experience. He worked with cold, professional efficiency, the same detachment he'd learned to apply to unpleasant necessities of war. He looped the rope around her waist in a simple but effective knot, the kind used for prisoners who needed to walk long distances. He made sure it wouldn't choke her or cut off circulation to her legs, checking the tension carefully. But it would absolutely prevent her from escaping without his knowledge. He left her hands completely free, a deliberate, tactical choice. A prisoner with bound hands would slow him down too much when navigating the difficult terrain ahead, unable to catch themselves if they fell or help climb obstacles, and if something attacked them in the jungle, she would need to be able to defend herself with rocks or sticks, or they would both die. He tied the other end of the rope to his own belt with a knot he could release quickly if needed, tested it with a sharp tug that made her stumble forward and nearly fall, and knotted in satisfaction. The rope was about 6 ft long, enough distance that she wouldn't constantly be bumping into him, but short enough that he could grab her quickly if danger appeared. The girl glared at him with such concentrated venom that Michael almost smiled despite the pain and exhaustion. If looks could kill, he would have been a smoking crater in the ground. Her small chest heaved with rage and fear in the aftermath of her futile struggle. But she was also clearly intelligent enough to understand her tactical situation. She was a prisoner now, bound to this human soldier who could kill her at any moment if he chose, and fighting further would only waste energy she might need later. Michael gestured toward the south, toward the dark line of jungle visible in the distance. Then he pointed at her, then at himself, and made a walking motion. The message was clear enough. We're going that way together, whether you like it or not. She spat at his feet, a gesture of defiance that transcended species. But she didn't resist when he started walking and the rope pulled taut between them. Michael looked around the battlefield one last time, trying to orient himself, using the position of the distant mountains and what he remembered from maps. The jungle lay to the south, thick and dark even from a distance, its canopy an unbroken ocean of green. North led to mountains he didn't recognize, probably enemy territory given how far south the battle had ranged. East and west were open plains where they would be visible for miles to any patrol, easy prey for mounted enemies. The jungle then, it offered cover, water, and 1,000 different ways to die. But at least they would be harder to spot. He started walking, his boots squelching in blood mud, and the rope between them went taut immediately as the girl instinctively resisted. She dug in her heels, pulling back against the rope. Michael didn't even turn around. He just kept walking at the same steady pace, and after a few seconds of futile resistance, she stumbled forward, having no choice but to follow or be dragged. They left the Valley of the Dead behind, walking through the eerie silence of the aftermath where not even flies had yet discovered the feast, and entered what the human soldiers had grimly nicknamed the Green Hell. The transition was shockingly abrupt, like stepping through an invisible curtain between two different worlds. One moment they were trudging across the ash-gray wasteland of the battlefield, open to the sky with visibility for miles in every direction, and the next they were swallowed by vegetation so thick and aggressive that the sunlight could barely penetrate to the forest floor below. The temperature jumped immediately, the air becoming thick and wet, coating exposed skin with moisture within seconds. The plants here were fundamentally wrong, in ways that set Michael's teeth on edge. Even after months on this alien world, evolution had taken different paths. Here arrived at different solutions to the problems of survival. The leaves had a strange plastic sheen, unnaturally reflective, and their edges were hard and sharp like knives made of rigid polymer. Many of them were serrated with tiny teeth designed to saw rather than cut. Touching them carelessly would open your skin as cleanly as a barber's razor. And Michael had seen men lose fingers to infected cuts from these plants. Bark of the trees was covered in thorns of various sizes and configurations, some as fine as sewing needles arranged in clusters, others thick as railroad spikes jutting out at irregular angles, and most of them wept a clear sticky sap that Michael had learned the hard way was mildly caustic, raising blisters on skin after prolonged contact. Every branch, every vine, every bit of undergrowth seemed specifically designed by some malevolent intelligence to cut, stab, poison, or entangle anything foolish enough to pass through. The canopy above was so dense that it created a permanent twilight on the forest floor, and strange phosphorescent fungi grew on dead wood, glowing faintly with an eerie blue-green light that made distances impossible to judge accurately. The air was filled with strange sounds, clicks and whistles and rustling, movements that could be anything from harmless tree-dwelling creatures to apex predators stalking their next meal. Michael led the way, hacking a crude path with a scavenged curved sword, the blade ringing against the hard woody stems. Each swing sent pain lancing through his wounded shoulder like someone was driving hot needles into the joint, fresh blood soaking through the makeshift bandage he'd tied around it. with strips from a dead man's shirt. But stopping meant dying, and dying meant this child would die too. Lost and alone in hostile territory. The jungle would reclaim any path within. Ours, the aggressive plant growth, filling gaps with terrifying speed, and if you couldn't make forward progress, you were already dead, just waiting for the jungle to finish the job. Behind him, at the end of the taut rope, the girl followed with surprising grace. Considering her injured leg, she was light on her feet, moving with an animal quality that suggested she was far more at home in this environment than he was, but she was also clearly engaged in deliberate passive resistance, constantly snagging herself on roots and vines, allowing branches to catch her clothing, slowing their overall progress to a crawl. Michael ignored it with the patience of a professional soldier. He had been in worse situations with far less cooperative prisoners. You didn't waste energy getting angry at things you couldn't change. The heat was absolutely oppressive, like being wrapped in a wet blanket soaked in hot water. The humidity had to be close to 100%. Sweat poured down Michael's face in streams, stinging his eyes, soaking his torn clothing. His throat was parched, feeling like he'd swallowed sand. Every breath was work, the thick air seeming to resist entering his lungs. They had been walking for perhaps 2 hours, Michael's legs starting to shake with exhaustion. When thirst became truly unbearable, he spotted a thick vine hanging from a massive tree, its surface glistening with moisture in the dim light. Clear liquid dripped steadily from where the vine had been broken, forming a small puddle on the ground that caught the light like crystal water. Thank whatever gods might be listening. He raised his knife to cut the vine and drink when the rope suddenly yanked hard sideways, nearly pulling him off balance. The girl made a sharp, piercing sound that was almost like a bird's alarm call, high and urgent. Michael turned to snap at her for interfering when he actually looked at her expression. Not defiance this time, not the sullen resistance she'd been showing. Her face showed genuine urgency, even fear. She was pointing at the vine, shaking her head violently, her whole body language screaming danger. Michael frowned, suspicious but also curious. The girl picked up a fallen branch from the jungle floor, dry and brittle, and jabbed it deliberately into the puddle of liquid beneath the vine. The wood hissed like bacon hitting a hot pan. Smoke rose in acrid wisps as the branch turned black almost instantly, the wood actually beginning to dissolve where the liquid touched it, releasing fumes that made Michael's eyes water even from several feet away. Not water, acid, strong enough to burn through wood in seconds, to dissolve organic matter on contact. If Michael had drunk it, it would have melted his throat from the inside out, dissolved his stomach, killed him in minutes of absolute agony. He lowered his knife slowly and looked at the girl. She had just saved his life, an alien child, his prisoner, his enemy by every definition that mattered, had saved his life. Their eyes met. In hers he saw something shift, not gratitude, certainly not trust, but a kind of predator's recognition. She was native to this world, born into it, raised with the knowledge of every poisonous plant and deadly creature. He was the outsider, the invader, stumbling through a death trap he barely understood. She knew this world. He was just trying not to die in it. Michael gave her a single nod, the barest Acknowledgement, the girl's expression remained mostly neutral, but there was a hint of smugness in the way she lifted her chin slightly. She knew something he didn't, and that knowledge had value. It made her useful, not just cargo. And GT snorts. And GT. They moved on, and Michael found himself paying more attention to where she looked, what she avoided, the small gestures she made that might signal danger he couldn't see. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the already dim jungle grew darker and infinitely more dangerous. The sounds changed dramatically. The rustling and calls of day creatures gave way to the hunting cries of night predators. Something screamed in the distance, a sound like metal being torn in half, and Michael felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Whatever made that noise, he never wanted to meet it. He knew they couldn't stay on the ground. When darkness fell, most of the serious predators on this world hunted at night, and they would be easy prey on the forest floor. Michael found what he was looking for: a massive tree with branches as thick as a man's torso, spreading out about 30 ft. Up. The trunk was relatively smooth compared to others with fewer thorns. Gritting his teeth against the pain in his shoulder, he began to climb, pulling them both upward. The girl climbed beside him, using her free hands and her good leg with surprising agility. She moved up the trunk like a squirrel, finding handholds Michael's larger bulk would never have managed. When they reached a stable branch thick enough to support both their weights, Michael tied her securely to the trunk with enough slack that she could shift positions and not cut off her circulation, but not enough that she could fall or attempt to escape by climbing down. While he slept, he settled himself on the thick branch, his back against the trunk, sword resting across his lap. Below, the jungle floor had become pitch black, an absolute void. Things moved down there in the darkness. He could hear them: the rustle of leaves, the snap of branches, the occasional hiss or growl. But he couldn't see a damn thing. The girl sat a few feet away, her golden ornaments catching what little moonlight managed to filter through the dense canopy above. She was shivering, whether from cold or fear or delayed shock. Michael couldn't tell. The temperature had actually dropped considerably with the sunset, and her clothing was thin and torn. Michael pulled his own tattered jacket tighter around himself and closed his eyes, forcing his body to rest even as his mind stayed alert. Sleep would come in snatches, never deep, always ready to wake at the first sign of threat. It was the only way to survive. Tomorrow would be harder. It always was. Dawn came with the agonized screams of something dying in the undergrowth far below. Michael woke instantly, his hand already on his weapon before his eyes fully opened. The girl was already awake, her wide eyes tracking the sounds below with the intensity of someone who knew exactly what was killing what down there. They descended carefully, Michael going first to check the ground for threats, then helping the girl down the last few feet. Her injured leg was clearly bothering her more after a night of limited movement, but she made no complaint, just limped along as they continued their journey deeper into the green hell. Michael's movements were noticeably slower this morning. The infection from his shoulder was spreading despite his best efforts to ignore it. He could feel the heat radiating from the wound, the skin around it swollen and tender to even the lightest touch. Dark red lines were creeping up toward his neck and down toward his chest. Blood poisoning sepsis, if it reached his heart or his brain, he was dead. But he couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying, just as surely as the infection. By midday, they reached a place where the jungle gave way to a rocky canyon that cut through the landscape like a wound carved by some giant's axe. The walls were sheer stone, rising clear as throat hundreds of feet on either side, bare of vegetation except for some scraggly growth in the cracks. The floor of the canyon was littered with bones of various sizes, some fresh, enough to still have scraps of meat and hide attached, others ancient and yellow with age. Michael knelt and examined the ground carefully. Deep claw marks scored the stone, grouped in sets of 4 parallel gauges. The marks were relatively fresh, certainly made within the last few days. He looked closer and noticed something odd about the tracks. There were no corresponding marks that would indicate eyes or a snout dragging along the ground when the creature moved. No visual tracking signs at all. Whatever made these tracks hunted by sound alone, blind predators that reacted to vibration and noise. He stood slowly and turned to look at the girl. She was staring at the canyon walls with visible fear, her body tense as a drawn bowstring, every muscle ready to bolt. She knew this place. She knew what lived here. Michael made a decision that would either save them both or kill them. He reached down and untied the rope from his belt. The girl's eyes went wide with shock and confusion as he placed the end of the rope in her small hand. He brought his finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. Then he pointed to himself, then to her, and made a walking gesture with 2 fingers. Follow me. Step exactly where I step. Make absolutely no sound whatsoever. This was the ultimate test. If she ran now, if she made noise trying to escape or in panic, they would both die. The blind hunters would swarm them, and Michael was in no condition to fight off multiple attackers. But if she wanted to live, if she had even a shred of self-preservation instinct left, she would have to trust him, trust the enemy, trust the human who had taken her prisoner. The girl's fingers closed slowly around the rope, her knuckles pale against her blue skin. She stared at Michael for a long moment, her golden eyes searching his face for something. Then she nodded once sharply and brought her own finger to her lips, mirroring his gesture. They began across the canyon, moving with agonizing slowness that made every second feel like an hour. Michael placed each foot with absolute precision, testing the ground with partial weight before committing fully. He avoided anything that might shift or roll. He stepped over bones rather than risk them cracking. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, silent as falling snow. Behind him, the girl followed in his exact footsteps, her smaller feet fitting easily in the impressions his boots left in the dusty stone. Her snort's breathing was so controlled, Michael could barely hear it, even though she was less than 2 yards behind him. They made it halfway across the 100-yard canyon before Michael's luck ran out. His boot came down on something he hadn't seen, hidden under a light layer of dust and old bone, dried and brittle, and it snapped with a sound like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the canyon. The response was immediate and terrifying. From holes in the canyon walls, from burrows Michael hadn't even noticed, burst 2 creatures unlike anything he'd ever seen. They were called whisperers by the few, soldiers who had encountered them and survived, though Michael only learned that later they were pale as maggots, their skin almost translucent, completely eyeless with heads that seemed to be mostly enormous ears, like fleshy satellites. They moved with horrifying speed despite their awkward appearance, their claws scraping against stone with a sound like nails on slate as they homed in on the source of the noise. Michael reacted on pure combat instinct. He grabbed the girl and literally threw her toward a narrow crack between two large boulders, a gap barely wide enough for her small frame. She hit the ground hard but scrambled into the protective crack without hesitation. Then Michael positioned himself directly in front of the opening, his body a living barrier between her and the creatures. He had seconds before they reached him. The first whisperer came at him in a blur of pale flesh and clicking claws. Michael raised the makeshift shield he'd fashioned earlier from thick tree bark, bound with vine, and took the impact. The creature's claws shredded through the bark like it was paper, but the barrier bought him a crucial second. He drove his sword up through the thing's soft underbelly, feeling the blade scrape against bone, and twisted viciously. The whisper shrieked, a sound that made Michael's teeth ache and his ears ring like grinding metal mixed with a dying rabbit's scream. It thrashed violently, nearly tearing the sword from Michael's grip, spraying black ichor across his face and chest. The second whisperer attacked from his blind side while he was dealing with the first, its jaws wide enough to fit a human head and lined with needle teeth, clamped onto his side just below the ribs. Michael felt the teeth punch through cloth and skin, grinding against bone. He roared in pain and fury, his free hand grabbing a rock the size of his fist. He brought it down on the creature's skull again and again and again, putting every ounce of strength he had left into each impact. Once, twice, three times, the whisperer's head caved in with a wet, crunching sound, and it finally released its grip and collapsed. Michael stumbled backward, blood pouring from the new wound in his side, and leaned heavily against the canyon wall. The silence returned slowly, broken only by his ragged breathing and the sound of his blood pattering on the stones. He stood there for several minutes, swaying slightly, making absolutely sure no more creatures were coming. Only when he was certain the threat had passed did he allow himself to slide down the wall and sit, pressing his hand against the bleeding wound in his side. The girl emerged slowly from her hiding place, her eyes wide. She stared at him with an expression Michael couldn't read. He had just saved her life again, taken injuries, protecting her from creatures that would have torn her apart in seconds. They couldn't stay here. Michael forced himself to stand, using his sword as a makeshift crutch. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body, but he pushed through it with the grim determination of a man who had survived too much to die in a random canyon. They staggered forward, and after another 100 yards of careful walking, they found salvation. A tiny spring seeping from a crack in the canyon wall, so small it was barely a trickle, forming a puddle no bigger than Michael's palm. Michael dropped to his knees in front of it like a pilgrim before a shrine. His vision was graying at the edges. Blood loss and dehydration was systematically shutting his body down. His hands shook uncontrollably as he cupped them under the thin stream of water. The girl stood a few feet away, watching him with those unreadable golden eyes. In her culture, as Michael would later learn, the strong took what they needed. First, the weak were left to fend for themselves or die. That was the fundamental law of survival that had governed her people for thousands of years. Michael filled his cupped hands with the cool, clear water. His cracked lips screamed for it. His swollen tongue felt like leather in his mouth. Every cell in his body begged him to drink. Instead, he turned slowly and held his cupped hands out to the girl, offering the water to her. Time seemed to stop. The girl froze, her eyes going wide with something that looked almost like shock. This was incomprehensible to her. The strong gave water to the weak, the captor to the prisoner, the human to the alien. She stepped forward hesitantly, as if approaching something that might be a trap or a trick. Then she bent her head and drank from his hands like a cat lapping milk, her small tongue taking the water with delicate precision. When she had drunk every drop, she quickly scooped her own small hands into the trickling spring and brought the water to Michael's mouth. He drank, and the water tasted like life itself, like hope, like maybe he wouldn't die in this canyon after all. They took turns until the spring's meager flow slowed to almost nothing. Then they helped each other stand and moved on, the invisible rope between them now something more than simple restraint. By evening, Michael was in serious trouble. The fever had him in its grip, and he knew it. The infection in his shoulder had spread aggressively, dark lines creeping up his neck like poisonous vines. The wound from the Whisperer's bite was not much better, the edges already showing signs of sepsis. He could barely walk straight, his feet stumbling over roots and rocks that should have been obvious. They found shelter beneath the gnarled, massive roots of an enormous tree that looked like it had been growing since before humans existed. Michael collapsed there, more than sat down, his consciousness flickering like a candle in strong wind. He knew with absolute certainty that he was dying. The infection was winning the battle. His body was waging against it. Through increasingly blurred vision, he saw the girl standing over him. For a moment, he thought she might simply leave him now, take her freedom while she could, disappear into the jungle and find her way home. It would be the smart thing to do, the logical choice. Instead, she knelt beside him and began examining his wounds with a clinical detachment that seemed far too adult for someone her age. Her small fingers probed the swollen flesh around his shoulder, and Michael hissed in pain. She stood abruptly and disappeared into the surrounding brush without explanation. Michael tried to stay awake, tried to keep watch, but his body was shutting down whether he wanted it to or not. He fell into a feverish half-sleep, populated by nightmares of battles and blood and a daughter's laughter he would never hear again. He didn't know how long she was gone. Time had become fluid and unreliable. But she returned eventually, carrying a bundle of strange blue moss that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. She sat cross-legged beside him and began to chew the moss methodically, working it in her mouth with the patient efficiency of someone who had been taught this process carefully. Then, without any warning or ceremony, she ripped the filthy, crusted bandage from Michael's shoulder wound. He jolted awake with a gasp of shock and pain, his whole body going rigid. Before he could react beyond that initial gasp, she spat the moss mixture directly into his open Wound, the pain was absolutely indescribable. It felt like she had poured molten metal into his shoulder, like every nerve ending was being burned with a branding iron simultaneously. Michael's hand shot out on pure, reflexive response and grabbed her throat, his fingers wrapping around the slender column. His vision went pure white from the agony, every muscle in his body locked up. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except exist in a universe of fire centered on his shoulder. But even through the pain, even with his hand wrapped around her throat in a grip that could easily crush her windpipe, some deeply buried part of his brain recognized what was happening. She was trying to help, not harm. This was medicine, not torture. Michael's fingers trembled violently, but he did not squeeze. He did not close his hand. He held her throat gently, almost tenderly, despite the white-hot agony, and forced himself to remain still. The girl did not struggle. She met his pain-mad eyes with her own calm golden gaze and continued her work with complete focus, packing the moss deep into the wound with her small fingers, then moving to the bite on his side and repeating the process. Each touch brought fresh waves of agony that made Michael see stars, but she was thorough and precise, the way someone is when they've been taught by a skilled healer. When she finally finished, she sat back and waited calmly. Michael's hand fell away from her throat, too weak to maintain the grip. He lay there gasping like a drowning man who just broken the surface, drenched in sweat that had nothing to do with the jungle heat. But after several long minutes, he realized something remarkable. The burning sensation was fading, being replaced by a strange numbness that was actually a relief after the constant throb of infection. The fever fog in his mind was clearing slightly, the worst of the delirium retreating. The infection's relentless spread had been checked, halted by whatever chemical properties the moss possessed when mixed with her saliva. Michael managed a weak nod of thanks, the only gesture he had strength for. The girl nodded back a brief acknowledgement, then curled up a few feet away and fell asleep with the instant unconsciousness of a cat, apparently trusting that he would not harm her in the night. He did not. Instead, he lay awake for a while longer, staring up at the canopy far above, processing what had just happened. An alien child, his enemy, his prisoner, had saved his life not once but multiple times now. The world was more complicated than the simple narratives of war suggested. 3 days passed in a blur of pain and slow healing. Michael did not die, which surprised him more than he cared to admit. The moss treatment, whatever alchemy occurred, when it mixed with the girl's saliva, pulled him back from the edge of the grave. The fever broke on the second day. The infection receded on the third. He was still weak, still hurt with every movement, but he could function. He could survive. More importantly, something fundamental had changed between them during those 3 days. The rope that had physically connected them was gone now, untied by the girl on the second night while Michael slept fitfully. She could have run then. She could have left him weak and vulnerable, taken her freedom, and disappeared into the jungle she knew far better than he ever would. She did not run, she stayed. Now they moved through the increasingly dense jungle as something approaching, partners rather than captor and prisoner. The girl walked ahead most of the time, her smaller frame and keener senses allowing her to spot hazards Michael's Bulk would miss, she pointed out. Poisonous plants with distinctive markings, unstable ground that looked solid but would collapse under weight. The territorial markers of predators. That should be given a wide berth. Michael in turn provided the raw strength she lacked when a massive fallen log blocked their path. He lifted one end and pivoted it aside. When the jungle grew too thick to navigate, he cut through it with methodical efficiency. When they reached a stream running too fast and deep for her to safely cross, he carried her on his back without being asked. They developed an intricate language of gestures, sounds, and shared understanding that transcended words. Short, sharp whistle meant immediate danger. Freeze in place. A hand on the shoulder meant stop and listen. 2 quick taps on a nearby tree meant water source ahead. A raised fist meant predator nearby. Stay absolutely still. They caught food together. Michael brought down a snake with a thrown rock, and the girl showed him which internal organs contained deadly venom and had to be removed carefully before the meat could be safely eaten. They roasted it over a tiny fire that the girl built with practiced efficiency, eating in companionable silence while strange bird calls echoed through the canopy above. On the 3rd evening of their partnership, they reached an obstacle that neither could overcome alone. A river, wide and fast-moving, cut directly across their path. The water was dark, almost black, and moved with the kind of speed that suggested dangerous depth. Crossing was necessary. There was no way around. That wouldn't add days to their journey, but it would be treacherous. Michael studied the river for several minutes, his experienced eye reading the currents and flow patterns. There was a relatively shallow section, about 50 yd downstream, where the water spread out over a rocky bed. But even there the current was strong, enough to sweep someone off their feet if they weren't careful. Giuliani was too small and light to cross safely on her own. The current would take her immediately, smash her against the rocks downstream, drown her, or break her bones against the stones. Michael could probably make it across, but not while carrying her, and not without significant risk. They needed another solution. Michael spent the next hour gathering materials while Giuliani watched with curious intensity. He cut long vines from the trees, testing each one for strength and flexibility. He selected the straightest, strongest fallen branch he could find, as thick as his forearm and about 10 ft long, using the vines and his knowledge of knots, learned over 2 decades of military service. He began constructing a simple but effective harness. When he was done, he had created a system where Giuliani could be securely attached to his back, her weight distributed across his shoulders and chest rather than hanging from his neck or waist. The harness would keep her above water level even if he slipped, and keep her hands free to hold on to him. He gestured for her to turn around and fitted the harness carefully, making sure it was snug but not too tight. Giuliani submitted to the process with surprising trust, standing still and allowing him to adjust the straps. When he was satisfied, he positioned the long branch across his shoulders like a yoke, tying it securely to the harness. This would give him better balance in the water and provide an emergency float if the worst happened. Michael tested his footing at the river's edge. The rocks were slippery, covered with a film of algae that made them treacherous. He found a stout walking stick, a piece of driftwood wedged between rocks and used it to probe the depth ahead. Then they entered the water together. The cold hit like a physical shock after days in the humid jungle heat. The current pulled at Michael's legs, immediately trying to sweep him downstream. He planted the walking stick, firmly moved 1 foot forward, carefully found solid ground, shifted. His weight moved the stick, repeated the process. Each step was a calculated risk. Halfway across, disaster nearly struck. Michael's boots slipped on a submerged rock and his legs shot out from under him. He went down hard on one knee, the water surging up to his chest, the current suddenly twice as strong. Giuliani gasped and gripped his shoulders tighter, but she didn't panic or thrash. She stayed centered, her weight distributed evenly, actually helping his balance rather than destroying it. Michael drove the walking stick down with desperate force, finding perches between 2 rocks. He pushed himself back upright, water streaming from his clothes, and continued forward. His wounded shoulder screamed in protest at the strain, but he ignored it. 3 more agonizing minutes of careful progress brought them to the far bank. Michael dragged them both out of the water and collapsed on the muddy shore, breathing hard. Giuliani climbed out of the harness and sat beside him, both of them soaked and shivering despite the warmth. She reached over and touched his wounded shoulder gently, checking that the moss bandage was still in place. Most of it had washed away in the crossing, but the wound beneath was clear as throat, clean, the infection truly gone. She nodded in satisfaction. Michael managed a tired smile. They had crossed together, neither one able to succeed alone. And GT, clear as throat. And GT, the partnership was complete now, fully formed through necessity and trust. It was during one of these quiet meals that Michael realized he didn't even know her name. He pointed to himself and said clearly, Michael, the first real words spoken between them in days. She looked at him with those unnervingly intelligent golden eyes that seemed to see far more than a 10-year-old should. Then she pointed to herself and said something in her language, a word with complex tones and syllables that sounded like music and poetry combined. Michael tried to repeat it and mangled it so badly that the girl made a sound that was unmistakably laughter, brief and surprised, as if she'd forgotten she could still laugh. She repeated her name slowly, breaking it into component parts for him. After several attempts and patient corrections, Michael managed something approximating the original. Giuliani. She nodded, accepting his human pronunciation of her alien name. From that moment on, she was Giuliani to him, and he was Michael to her, and they were no longer quite as much strangers. On the 4th day since the canyon, they emerged from the dense jungle into more open terrain, an old riverbed long dried and abandoned by whatever water had once flowed there, cut through the landscape in a wide swath. The exposed stones and packed earth made for significantly easier walking compared to the endless undergrowth they'd been fighting through, and Michael gratefully increased their pace. His wounds were healing well enough to function, and he was eager to put more distance between them and the battlefield that seemed like a lifetime ago now. His eagerness made him careless. That was a mistake. Michael smelled them before he saw them, his nose catching the distinctive scent of unwashed bodies, poorly cured leather and old blood. Combat veteran Instinct screaming alarm, he grabbed Giuliani and pulled her down hard behind a large boulder just as the patrol came into view in the riverbed below their position. There were 5 of them, and Michael's heart sank as he recognized what they were. Not regular warriors from Giuliani's people, but something worse. Their skin was darker blue than Giuliani's, almost purple in the harsh sunlight, and they wore armor made from bone plates and hardened leather, decorated with trophies taken from kills. They carried weapons that were crude but brutally effective. Axes made from sharpened stone, lashed to ironwood handles, spears tipped with carved bone, heavy clubs studded with predator teeth. The wildlings, outcasts from the main alien civilization, tribes that had rejected Lenarosa's rule generations ago and made savage war on everyone, their own kind and humans alike. They took no prisoners, they left no survivors. They were the bogeymen that both species told their children about, to make them behave. Michael watched with growing dread as they moved along the dried riverbed, their heads low, sniffing at the ground. Like hunting dogs, they were tracking something with the methodical patience of experienced hunters. With a sinking feeling in his gut, Michael realized they were following footprints in the dust, his and Giuliani's. He looked at the girl crouched beside him. Her face had gone pale, the blue of her skin almost gray with fear. Her whole body was trembling slightly. She knew these hunters, knew their reputation, knew exactly what they did to anyone they caught, especially to children of the royal bloodline they despised. Michael assessed their tactical situation with brutal honesty, honed by 20 years of warfare. 5 warriors, all fresh and uninjured, well-armed and clearly skilled at their craft, against 1 wounded human soldier and a small child. On this open ground they would be spotted and run down within minutes. His legs still ached from accumulated injuries, slowing him. Carrying Giuliani would slow him even more. Running was not an option that ended with survival, which meant he had to fight, and to fight with any realistic chance of success against those odds. He needed every advantage he could manufacture or steal. His tactical mind worked rapidly, cataloging the terrain, the resources, the possibilities. He found what he was looking for, a hollow space in the massive roots of a long-dead tree, barely visible behind a natural curtain of hanging moss and vines. The entrance was small, probably too small for an adult warrior to easily follow. He pushed Giuliani toward the hollow, arranging branches and moss to conceal the entrance as thoroughly as possible. Then he pressed his knife into her small hand, transferring his last spare weapon to her. It was a poor defense against multiple attackers, but it was something. Their eyes met, and no words were necessary. The message was crystal clear in the look they exchanged. Stay hidden, stay clear's throat. Absolutely silent, no matter what you hear, no matter what happens, do not come out, do not make a sound. She nodded, her golden eyes wide but determined, her fingers closed around the knife handle with a grip that turned her knuckles pale. Michael stood, took a deep breath, and deliberately snapped a dry branch. Underfoot, the sharp crack echoed across the riverbed like a gunshot. All 5 wilding hunters' heads whipped toward the noise with predatory synchronization. They saw him standing there alone, a human soldier, wounded and tired, seemingly easy prey. Their hunting calls rose into the air, ululating war cries that set Michael's nerves jangling, but he didn't run away from them. Instead, he turned and ran at an angle, deliberately breaking more branches, disturbing stones, leaving a trail a blind man could follow. He was drawing them away from Giuliani's hiding spot, leading them into terrain he had scouted during their approach. The wildlings pursued with the disciplined efficiency of a wolf pack. They were fast, significantly faster than a limping human, and they knew it. They spread out in a practice formation, designed to encircle prey, prevent escape, ensure the kill. Michael ran toward a narrow ravine he had noted earlier, a place where massive rocks had fallen in some ancient landslide to create a natural choke point no more than 6 ft wide. If he was going to die today, and the odds certainly suggested he was, then he would make these bastards pay in blood for the privilege of killing him. He would make it count. He reached the ravine entrance and spun to face his pursuers. 3 approached from directly ahead. The other 2 had split off to flank, trying to get behind him or attack from the sides. He had perhaps 10 seconds before they overwhelmed him through sheer numbers. But Michael had prepared more than his stand location. And GT clears throat. And GT, days of moving through hostile jungle had taught him old skills from his earliest military training. The first wildling rushed into the ravine entrance with his stone axe raised, confident and eager for the kill. Michael had set a simple trap at the choke point using materials that cost him nothing but time. A sharpened wooden stake carved from ironwood and fire hardened to the strength of steel, held under tremendous tension by a bent sapling and a trigger line hidden beneath scattered leaves. The wildling's foot hit the trigger line. The sapling released with a twang, like a bow firing, and the stake shot forward with enough force to punch completely through the warrior's chest and out his back in a spray of blue-black blood. The wildling's expression of confidence froze into shock. He looked down at the wooden spike protruding from his sternum, made a wet choking sound, and collapsed. The second wildling, following close behind his companion, hesitated for a crucial second, shocked by the sudden death. Michael didn't give him time to recover from that hesitation. He snatched a fist-sized rock from the ground and hurled it with all the strength his wounded body could muster. It caught the warrior in the temple with a crack like breaking pottery, and he went down hard, stunned. Michael was on him before he could shake off the impact, driving his sword down through the gap between neck and shoulder where the bone armor didn't quite meet. The blade scraped against collarbone and cut deep into vital arteries. The remaining 3 wildlings came at him together, having learned the hard lesson that overconfidence killed you when fighting this particular human. The fight devolved immediately into a brutal close-quarters brawl in the mud and stones of the ravine, the kind of combat that had no rules, no honor, no elegance whatsoever. Michael had no elegant technique left to deploy. He fought like a cornered animal that knew its death was coming but refused to make it easy, using knees, elbows, teeth, anything and everything that could hurt or kill. One wildling managed to get behind him and wrapped a powerful arm around Michael's throat, cutting off his air with professional efficiency. Michael drove his head backward with desperate force, hearing and feeling the crunch as he broke the warrior's nose. Then he grabbed the choking arm with both hands and bit down savagely until He tasted blood thick and alien in his mouth, the grip loosened just enough. He spun inside the hold and drove his sword up through the wounded warrior's gut, twisting the blade viciously before yanking it free. The last two circled him warily now, reassessing their prey. Michael was breathing hard, bleeding from a dozen new cuts and gashes, his vision starting to tunnel. One of the remaining wildlings was clearly the group's leader, bigger than the others, and wearing a necklace of finger bones that marked successful kills. He grinned at Michael, showing teeth that had been filed to points. They attacked from opposite sides simultaneously, coordinated assault designed to split his attention. Michael barely managed to parry one spear thrust with his sword, the impact sending shock waves of pain through his wounded shoulder, leaving himself completely open to the second attacker. The second spear didn't miss. It scored a deep cut along his ribs on the right side, opening flesh and scraping bone. Michael grunted in pain and staggered, his footing uncertain on the blood-slicked rocks. The leader pressed the advantage, immediately seeing his prey faltering. They grappled together, both weapons lost in the struggle, falling into the muddy ground and wrestling like animals. The wildling was immensely strong, his hands closing around Michael's throat. With crushing force, black spots danced and multiplied in Michael's vision as his air supply was cut off. His hands scrabbled desperately in the filthy mud, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon. His fingers closed around something, and some distant part of his oxygen-starved brain recognized the shape, the broken shaft of an arrow, the same one he had pulled from his own shoulder. What felt like years ago, still crusted with his dried blood and sharp as any knife. With the last dregs of his strength and the desperation of a dying man, Michael drove the arrow fragment upward into the soft flesh under the wildling's jaw. The sharp bone point punched through the bottom of the warrior's mouth and kept going into the soft palate and beyond. The wildling's eyes went wide with shock and pain. His crushing grip on Michael's throat loosened and then released entirely. Blood thick and dark poured from his mouth. Michael pushed the heavy corpse off him with shaking arms and lay there in the blood-soaked mud, physically unable to move another inch. 5 enemies dead. 5 trained warriors killed by one injured human who should have died a dozen times over, but victory had cost him everything he had left. The world faded to gray around the edges, then to black. He came back to awareness slowly, confused about why he wasn't dead yet. He felt small hands tugging insistently at his torn clothing, pulling at his arm. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, he recognized Giuliani. She had emerged from her hiding spot and found him lying in the killing ground. Her face was streaked with tears, the first real emotion he'd seen from her, beyond anger or fear. But her expression was set with fierce determination. She was pulling at him, trying to get him to move, to stand, to do anything except lie there dying. Michael groaned, a sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest. Every single part of his body hurt. Moving seemed like an impossible task. But those small hands kept pulling, kept insisting, and slowly, agonizingly, he forced himself to sit up. Giuliani had not abandoned him. She had waited. Now she was trying to save him, just as he had saved her, together, supporting each other in a stumbling parody of walking. They staggered away from the ravine and its fresh corpses, Giuliani guided him when his vision blurred too much to see clearly, supporting his weight as much as her small frame possibly could. They walked for what felt like hours but was probably much less. Eventually they reached the base of a massive cliff face that rose almost vertically toward the sky, far above, carved impossibly into the sheer rock. Michael could see the unmistakable silhouette of a fortress. Flags bearing an alien crest he didn't recognize flew from the towers, snapping in the high-altitude wind. Lena Ross's stronghold, Giuliani's home, safety for her at least. Between them and that safety lay a climb of several hundred feet up sheer rock. Giuliani pointed to what Michael initially couldn't even see. A narrow trail, barely more than occasional handholds and tiny ledges that zigzagged up the cliff face at a nearly vertical angle. It was a goat path, treacherous and exposed to the elements, the kind of route that would be left completely unguarded because no army could possibly use it for assault. Michael looked at that impossible climb and knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't make it. Not in his current condition, not wounded and not while carrying a child on his back. But he also knew with equal certainty that he had absolutely no choice. He knelt down without a word, and Giuliani climbed onto his back without needing to be asked. She wrapped her thin arms around his neck and her legs around his waist, making herself as small and light as physically possible, becoming part of him rather than a burden. Michael began to climb. Every handhold was purchased with agony. His fingers, already cut and battered from days of hard travel, bled freely as he gripped the rough volcanic stone. His wounded shoulder screamed with each pull-up, the healing tissue threatening to tear open again. The fresh cut along his ribs felt like it was splitting wider with every movement. The wind buffeted them, constantly trying with malicious persistence to tear them from the cliff face and send them tumbling to their deaths hundreds of feet below. Halfway up, Michael's boots slipped on a patch of loose gravel. For one sickening, eternal moment he hung by his fingertips alone, Giuliani's weight on his back pulling him inexorably backward into empty air. And the long fall to death. She made a small, frightened sound but didn't panic, didn't struggle or thrash. She stayed absolutely still, trusting him completely with her life. Michael's fingers found purchase on a tiny lip of stone he couldn't even see. He dragged them both back against the cliff face, found a new foothold, and kept climbing because the only other option was falling. The sun set as they climbed, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. That would have been beautiful if Michael had possessed the capacity to notice. Darkness made the ascent exponentially more dangerous, each handhold now gamble, each foothold a prayer. But stopping meant his muscles would lock up, his strength would finally abandon him completely, and they would fall. So he climbed by feel and instinct and will alone, one hand over the other, one foot after another, because stopping meant death. When his hand finally closed over the edge of the plateau at the top of the cliff and found solid ground instead of empty air, Michael almost didn't believe it was real. He thought for a moment he might be hallucinating, that his oxygen-starved brain was conjuring comfort at the moment of death. But the stone was real. He hauled them both over the lip with strength he didn't know he still possessed, and collapsed on the blessedly flat, solid ground, gasping like a drowning man who Just broken the surface, Giuliani climbed off his back carefully, as if afraid he might shatter. She stood on shaking legs and looked toward the fortress gates, now visible less than a quarter-mile away across open ground. Michael forced himself to his feet. Through sheer bloody-minded stubbornness, he must have looked like something risen from a grave or escaped from hell. His clothing was torn to tatters that barely covered him. He was covered in layers of blood, his own and that of the enemies he'd killed, some dried to black crust, some still wet and fresh. Mud caked his hair and beard, turning him into a golem of filth. His eyes were sunken deep in his skull, his face gaunt from days of inadequate food and constant physical stress. But he was alive, and more importantly, so was she. They walked toward the gates together. The first arrow was a warning shot that nearly took Michael's head off. It whistled past his ear close, enough that he felt the wind of its passage and shattered against stone. Behind him, he froze instantly, every combat instinct screaming. Above them on the fortress walls, dozens of archers appeared as if materializing from thin air, their bows drawn and arrows knocked, all aimed directly at him. A deep horn sounded its resonant call, summoning the garrison to arms and warning of an intruder. More warriors flooded onto the battlements with disciplined speed until Michael was looking at what had to be at least 100 bows, all trained on him with professional steadiness. All they could see from their vantage point was a human soldier, battered and bloody but still armed, approaching their gates, an enemy, a threat to be eliminated. They couldn't see Giuliani, yet hidden beneath Michael's tattered cloak and pressed against his chest, where he'd instinctively pulled her when the first arrow flew. Michael took another step forward, moving slowly and deliberately. 20 more bows tracked his movement with minute adjustments. He could hear the creak of bowstrings being drawn to full tension, could practically feel the archers' fingers resting on the releases, waiting for the order to turn him into a pin cushion. He took another step, then another. Voice shouted from the walls in the alien language, harsh and commanding. Michael didn't understand the specific words, but the meaning was absolutely clear in the tone and context. Stop moving or we will kill you right now. Michael stopped walking. He was perhaps 50 yards from the massive gates, close enough to see individual faces on the walls, to see the hatred and the readiness to kill in their eyes, moving with exaggerated slowness, telegraphing every single action so no nervous archer would misinterpret and lose. Michael unbuckled his belt with one hand. His sword and the knife he'd taken back from Giuliani fell to the ground with a clatter of metal on stone that sounded impossibly loud in the tense silence. He held his hands out to his sides, showing empty palms, no weapons, no thread. Then his legs simply gave out beneath him and he sank to his knees. This wasn't a deliberate gesture of surrender or supplication. This was simply the absolute end of his physical reserves. His body had carried him as far as it possibly could and would carry him no further. His head bowed, not in submission to his enemies, but because his neck muscles could no longer support its weight. For a long suspended moment that felt like it lasted hours, nothing happened. The fortress held its collective breath. The archers maintained their aim, fingers on releases, waiting for the order to loose 100 arrows and end This strange confrontation. Michael waited for death to come, almost welcoming it after everything he'd endured. Then he did the only thing he had left to do, with hands that trembled from exhaustion and blood loss. He grasped his tattered cloak and pulled it open. Giuliani stepped out from beneath the makeshift shelter and into the full light of the torches that lined the fortress walls. Her golden collar gleamed in the firelight, catching the eye of every warrior and marking her unmistakably as nobility. Her distinctive blue skin, though filthy and scratched, was recognizable. She was alive, she was whole, she was unharmed in any serious way. The contrast was stark, impossible to misinterpret even from the walls. The broken, bloody human soldier, kneeling in the dirt, clearly at the absolute limit of his endurance, and the alien princess standing beside him, safe and protected. But Giuliani didn't run toward the gates and the safety they represented. She didn't abandon the human who had brought her home at the threshold of her salvation. Instead, she did something that shocked everyone watching. She placed her small blue hand on Michael's shoulder, the left one, the one she had treated with her people's medicine, the one that bore the physical mark of her care and her decision to save his life. She looked up at the assembled warriors. On the walls, her young face set with an expression that was far too adult, far too regal for a 10-year-old child. Her eyes blazed with an authority that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with bloodline and will. She didn't say a single word. She didn't need to. The gesture, her hand on his shoulder, her body positioned slightly in front of him in a protective stance, said everything that needed saying. This human is under my protection. He belongs to me. Anyone who harms him will answer to me. On the walls, confusion replaced hostile certainty. Warriors lowered their bows slightly, looking to each other and their commanders for guidance. What did this mean? How had the lost princess, given up for dead after the battle, returned in the company of an enemy soldier? What story lay behind this impossible scene? The massive fortress gates, each one carved from a single enormous tree and bound with metal, groaned as they began to swing open. The sound of their movement was like the earth itself grinding. A group of warriors rushed out, moving in tight formation, weapons ready. Despite the apparent truce, they were led by a figure Michael recognized from intelligence briefings and battlefield descriptions, though he'd never expected to see her in person. Lenerosa herself, the alien queen, commander of armies, ruler of territories that stretched beyond any map Michael had ever seen. A warrior of legendary skill who had personally led her forces in dozens of major battles. She wore armor of dark metal that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. Her blue skin was darker than Giuliani's, marked with pale scars from 100 combats that she wore like badges of honor rather than hiding. Her hair was bound in complex warrior braids that denoted rank and victories. She carried herself with absolute authority, the kind that came from leading armies and being obeyed without question. But all clears throat, her strength, all her martial prowess, all her authority and power meant absolutely nothing in that moment. She fell to her knees before her daughter, and the mighty queen became simply a mother who had thought her child was dead. She pulled Giuliani into an embrace that was almost desperate in its intensity. her hands running over the child's body. With frantic urgency, checking for injuries, reassuring herself that this was real, that Giuliani was truly there and truly alive, and not some cruel hallucination. Royal guards surrounded them in a protective formation, and several elite warriors began moving toward Michael. With weapons leveled, one of them, a massive soldier carrying a sword that looked like it could cut a man in half, raised his blade for what was clearly going to be an execution stroke. Michael's life had been spared temporarily to return the princess, but now that she was safe, the enemy could be disposed of. Michael didn't even react to the approaching death. He was too tired to fight, too empty to care anymore. If death came for him now, at least he had accomplished his goal. Giuliani was safe, she was home. That would have to be enough meaning for a life that had lost most of its meaning years ago. The sword began its downward arc. Giuliani's hand shot out and grabbed her mother's wrist with surprising strength. For someone so small, yanking it urgently and making a sharp, insistent sound. She pointed at Michael's shoulder, at the distinctive blue moss that was still partially visible at the edges of his wound, dried and crusted, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what it was. Lenarosa went absolutely still, frozen in place. She recognized that moss immediately. That specific treatment was part of her people's medical traditions, taught carefully from parent to child, passed down through generations. Preparation required specific knowledge: which moss to gather, how to process it, the importance of saliva from their species to activate its healing properties. Only Giuliani could have applied that treatment to this human. No one else had been there. Understanding crashed over the queen's face like a wave, washing away assumptions and replacing them with a complex truth. This human soldier had not kidnapped her daughter. He had not harmed her. He had protected her, kept her alive through dangers that would have killed her a dozen times over, and she, in return, had saved his life with her knowledge and her medicine. They had kept each other alive, enemies by every definition that mattered, from different species, on opposite sides of a brutal war. But they had formed a bond of mutual survival that transcended all of that. Lenarosa stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She reached to her belt and drew a ceremonial knife that Michael recognized from intelligence briefings as a mark of her office. The blade was obsidian, black volcanic glass worked to a molecular edge and decorated with gold wire inlay. It was a weapon that could kill with the tiniest cut, but it was also a symbol of judicial authority. For a moment, Michael thought this would be the end after all, that she would execute him herself with that symbolic blade as some kind of formal judgment. Instead, Lenore Ash raised the knife high and then drove it point first into the ground directly at Michael's feet, where it stood quivering in the hard-packed earth. The assembled warriors gasped, a collective sound of shock. In their culture, as Michael would learn later, this was the highest honor that could possibly be given to an enemy. The ceremonial knife offered meant the gift of life freely given, the recognition that the recipient had worth equal to the giver, and acknowledgement that they had earned their survival through deeds that transcended the simple categories of friend and enemy. Michael raised his head slowly and met the Queen's eyes. She was studying him with an intensity That felt like it could see through flesh to whatever lay beneath. But Michael had nothing to hide in, nothing left to fear. There was no plea in his gaze, no request for mercy or favor, just the cold, quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to lose and no reason left to pretend or dissemble. He understood the gesture's significance, even without understanding the detailed cultural context. She was offering him life and honor when she could have easily ordered his execution, but he didn't reach for the knife. He didn't want their symbols or their honors or any obligation that might come with them. He simply looked at Giuliani one last time, allowing himself that final goodbye. She was crying openly now, tears streaming down her blue face in rivers, but she didn't speak or call out. She understood what was happening. She knew this was farewell. Michael pushed himself to his feet, swaying dangerously but standing under his own power. His body protested every movement, but he forced it to obey. He turned his back on the assembled army, on the queen with her offered knife, on the fortress and everything it represented, and he walked away. He walked past the royal guards who parted for him in stunned silence, too shocked by what they were witnessing to even think of stopping him, past his discarded weapons lying in the dirt which he left where they had fallen because he didn't want them anymore. He walked back toward the cliff edge, back toward the dark jungle below, back into the wilderness that would probably kill him within days, but he walked as a free man on his own terms, bound to nothing and no one by obligation or debt. The imaginary camera pulled back and up, gaining altitude and perspective. The fortress with its hundreds of torches and its army of warriors grew smaller in the frame. The solitary figure of the human walking away became a tiny speck of movement against the vast darkness of the alien landscape spreading out below the cliff. Michael disappeared into the gathering night. And GT snorts. And GT, becoming one with the shadows alone. Again after his brief partnership with the alien child. Behind him on the fortress walls, Giuliani watched his retreating back until the darkness swallowed him completely and there was nothing left to see but night. Her mother stood beside her, one strong arm around the child's shoulders in comfort and support. The queen didn't call him back or send warriors after him. Some debts ran too deep to be repaid with words or gestures. Some warriors earned their freedom through their deeds, and any attempt to constrain that freedom afterward would diminish both the warrior and those who tried to claim them. The massive gates closed with a boom of finality that echoed across the plateau. The guards returned to their posts. The emergency was over. The princess was safe. Life would return to normal. Except nothing was quite normal anymore. Not really. The night deepened around the fortress, and far below in the jungle the darkness stirred with the sounds of creatures hunting and being hunted, dying and killing, the eternal cycle continuing without pause. Another day ending on a world torn by endless war, where different colored blood soaked the same in different earth, and where occasionally, very occasionally, something happened that transcended all the violence and hatred. Michael walked on through the green hell, his silhouette already consumed by shadows and the rising mist, whether he would find his way to friendly human territory, whether he would survive the jungle's countless dangers, whether he would ever see anything resembling home Again, no one could say. The future was uncertain, written in water, but he had done what he set out to do. He had survived against impossible odds. And along the way, in the company of an enemy child who had become something else entirely, something that had no name in either of their languages, he had remembered what it meant to protect something beyond himself. The rope that had once physically bound them was long gone, cut by small blue hands in the darkness of the second night, but the invisible thread that had formed between a grizzled human warrior and an alien princess remained unbreakable, despite the distance now growing between them. On the fortress walls, Lenerosa gave quiet orders to her senior commanders. The army would withdraw from certain disputed territories. Patrols would be redirected away from areas where human refugees were known to shelter. A message would be sent under flag of truce to the human commanders, an unprecedented gesture in an age that had raged for generations, offering the respectful return of their fallen soldiers' remains and the possibility, however fragile and tentative, of dialogue instead of constant slaughter. It wouldn't end the war. Nothing so simple could erase centuries of accumulated hatred and generational trauma and the momentum of cultures built around eternal conflict. But it was a beginning, the first crack in a wall that had seemed completely impenetrable, a possibility that had not existed before, all because one soldier, in the chaos of a lost battle, had chosen to save rather than kill, and one child had chosen to trust rather than hate. Giuliani was led inside by attendants who fussed over her, bringing her to hot food and warm clothes and soft beds and all the comforts and safety she had been denied for too many days. But she looked back once more before entering the fortress proper, back toward the darkness beyond the walls, toward the place where the human had vanished into the hostile wild. She spoke a single word in her language, too quiet for anyone else to hear over the wind and the activity around her, a word that meant warrior in the highest sense, not just someone who fought, but someone who protected, a word that also meant friend, though that translation was imperfect and incomplete. Then she turned and walked into the warm light of her home, carrying her own invisible thread back to a life and a warmth she had almost lost forever. The battlefield where they had first met lay far behind them now, already being reclaimed by scavengers and the indifferent processes of nature. The bodies would rot and return to the earth. The blood would wash away with the next rain. The war would continue its grinding forward momentum, because wars, once started, develop a terrible life of their own. But in the space between those two figures, the one walking into darkness and the one walking into light, something fundamental had changed. A single thread of understanding had been spun between enemy species, as fragile as spider silk in appearance, but strong as steel cable in reality. Whether that thread would hold against the weight of history and hatred, whether it would grow and strengthen or snap under the first real pressure, whether it mattered at all in the vast machinery of war, in politics and ancient grievances, only time would tell. But on that night, under alien stars that formed constellations no human astronomer had ever named, it was enough. Michael's footsteps faded into the jungle, sounds becoming indistinguishable from the wind and the rustle of hunting creatures. Giuliani's hand slipped into her mother's larger one, finding comfort, familiar touch. Two worlds that had briefly intersected were now diverging again, following their separate trajectories into an uncertain future. Yet both had been irrevocably changed by the meeting. Both carried something new forward with them, a memory of connection that defied every logical categorization their cultures had constructed, and in a universe that seemed built on violence and separation, and the eternal conflict between different kinds of life, even that small change represented a kind of victory, the kind that wouldn't be recorded in any history book or celebrated in any song, but that mattered nonetheless. The fortress lights dimmed as the garrison stood down from alert status. The jungle grew quieter as the night predators settled into their hunting patterns. The darkness deepened toward the absolute black of a moonless night on an alien world. And somewhere in that darkness, a man with nothing left to lose except his own stubborn humanity kept walking forward, one foot in front of the other, because that was what survivors did. They kept moving forward. They didn't stop until the journey ended or began anew in whatever lay beyond the next horizon. His destination was uncertain. His clear's throat. Survival was improbable. But he was free and he was moving, and for the moment that was enough.